March 15, 1942, Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. The memo arrived at the War Department on typewriter paper, carbon-copied, stamped with the seal of urgency that marked everything in those frantic months after Pearl Harbor. It carried a recommendation that would have seemed impossible just years before, almost laughable to some, terrifying to others: the activation of an all-black tank battalion. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair stood before the map in his Washington office, studying the disposition of American forces being shaped for a war that stretched across 2 oceans. As commander of Army Ground Forces, he understood what most of his contemporaries refused to acknowledge: that America could not fight a global war without using every resource at its disposal, and that included the millions of black men who had answered their country's call, only to find themselves relegated to loading supplies, building roads, serving meals to white soldiers who would do the actual fighting. McNair had seen the studies. He knew the arguments. Prevailing wisdom among military leadership held that black soldiers lacked the intelligence, discipline, and courage for combat, that they would panic under fire, couldn't master complex machinery, that white troops would refuse to fight alongside them. These beliefs ran deep, rooted in centuries of prejudice that had been codified into law and military doctrine. But McNair also understood mathematics. The United States was raising an army of millions while simultaneously fighting on multiple continents. Luxury of racial prejudice was becoming a strategic liability the nation could no longer afford. The experiment began on April 1, 1942, when the 761st Tank Battalion officially activated at Camp Claiborne. 6 white officers, 30 black officers, 676 black enlisted men, all volunteers, all determined to prove something that shouldn't have needed proving: that courage has no color. They arrived at a training facility carved from Louisiana swampland, where the humidity turned uniforms into wet rags and mosquitoes swarmed in biblical plagues. The black tankers were housed in the segregated section of the base, nearly a mile from the main gate, where the roads remained unpaved dirt that became boot, sucking mud when it rained. Their barracks sat next to the sewage treatment facility. The message was clear before a single order was given. Among those first arrivals was a young man from Tecumseh, Oklahoma, named Ruben Rivers. 6 feet 2 inches tall, soft-spoken. One of 12 children who had worked his family's farm before the railroad took him away from rural poverty. He had 2 brothers who would also enlist, but only Ruben would be assigned to a combat unit. He reported to Camp Claiborne in March 1942 with a simple objective: to serve his country. What he found was a nation that questioned whether he deserved to be called a countryman at all. Began with the M5 Stuart light tank, a cramped steel box armed with a 37mm main gun and 30 caliber machine guns. 4 men would operate each vehicle: commander, gunner, driver, and assistant driver. They learned to maneuver, to maintain, to fight from inside a machine that could become a coffin in seconds if something went wrong. Captain Charles Calvert, commanding Able Company, watched Rivers with growing respect. The young man from Oklahoma possessed an instinctive understanding of armored warfare. He moved with precision. He anticipated problems. When Calvert promoted him to sergeant, it was based on merit alone. A revolutionary concept in an army where black men were typically assumed incapable of leadership. Technical proficiency alone wouldn't be enough. The men of the 761st were learning to fight 2 wars simultaneously. One against the enemy they would face overseas, one against the prejudice they faced every day in the country they'd sworn to protect. In Alexandria, Louisiana, a neighboring town where soldiers went to find whatever recreation they could in wartime America, tensions between black troops and white military police exploded into violence on January 10, 1942. A riot erupted that left multiple soldiers hospitalized and sent shockwaves through black units stationed in the region. Several members of the 761st, hearing about the incident, steered 6 tanks and a half track, intent on retaliating against the injustice. It took Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates to talk them down. Bates had assumed command of the battalion in May 1943. He was unlike most white officers of his era. He had trained under George Patton himself and understood armor warfare at the highest level. More importantly, he saw his men as soldiers first, worthy of respect and capable of greatness, regardless of the color of their skin. He promised the tankers he would address the situation through proper channels. More critically, he promised them something else, that he would lead them into combat, that their training would not be wasted, that they would get their chance to prove themselves on the battlefield. It was a promise that would take 2 years to fulfill. Battalion moved to Camp Livingston in August 1942 for intensive maneuvers with the 85th Infantry Division and the all-black 92nd Infantry Division. For 2 months they conducted combat simulations, working alongside infantry for the first time. The 761st performed admirably, matching or exceeding the performance of white tank battalions. Lieutenant General Ben Lear, commanding the Second Army, rated them superior and declared them combat ready. But being combat ready and being sent to combat were two different things. In April 1943, deployed again for Third Army maneuvers at Camp Polk, Louisiana. More simulations, more training, more waiting while white units with far less preparation shipped overseas. The message became impossible. To ignore black soldiers, could train alongside whites, could match their performance, could even exceed it. But they still wouldn't be trusted to fight. The frustration grew with each passing month. Men who had volunteered to defend freedom found themselves trapped in a Jim Crow army, in a Jim Crow South, where they couldn't eat at the same restaurants, from the same water fountains, or walk the same streets as white civilians without risking violence. Where excellence meant nothing compared to the color of your skin. Then, in September 1943, everything changed. The 761st received orders to transfer to Camp Hood, Texas. More significantly, they received new equipment, the M4 Sherman medium tank. The Sherman was the backbone of American armored warfare, armed with a 75mm main gun, 2 30 caliber machine guns, the 50 caliber machine gun, and a 2-inch smoke mortar. It was faster, heavier, and far more powerful than the light tanks they'd been training on. The upgrade meant something. It suggested that someone, somewhere, was finally taking them seriously. At Camp Hood, training intensified. Colonel Bates pushed his men relentlessly, knowing that when they finally got their chance, there would be no margin for error. Every mistake would be used as evidence that the entire experiment had failed. Every death would be proof that black men couldn't handle combat. The pressure was enormous, unfair, and inescapable. Among the officers training with the 761st was a young lieutenant named Jack Roosevelt Robinson, an athlete who had starred in football, basketball, baseball, and track at UCLA. Robinson served as the battalion's morale officer, using his natural charisma to keep spirits high despite the daily indignities of segregation. Even Robinson's athletic fame couldn't protect him from the realities of Jim Crow Texas. On July 6, 1944, Robinson traveled by bus from McCloskey Hospital, where he was being treated for an ankle injury, to Camp Hood's Colored Officers Club. He took a seat next to Virginia Jones, the wife of a fellow black officer. Jones had light skin. The white bus driver, looking in his rearview mirror, saw what he thought was a black officer sitting next to a white woman. "AU! Get to the back of the bus where you belong." Robinson, who knew that Army regulations had recently banned segregation on military buses, refused. What followed was a court-martial that nearly ended Robinson's military career and kept him from deploying overseas with the battalion. Colonel Bates, believing the charges were unjust, refused to sign the court-martial papers. Robinson was transferred to the 758th Tank Battalion, whose commander was more willing to cooperate. On August 2, 1944, Robinson stood trial on charges of insubordination. After 4.5 hours of testimony, he was acquitted. But the damage was done. Robinson never joined his comrades overseas, who would later break baseball's color barrier and become one of America's greatest civil rights pioneers. Instead coached athletic teams at Camp Breckinridge, Kentucky. His honorable discharge in November 1944. For the 761st, Robinson's absence was a loss, but not a defeat. They had been training for over 2 years, far longer than most tank battalions received. They were, by any objective measure, among the best trained armored units in the entire U.S. Army. On June 9, 1944, just 3 days after D-Day, the news finally came. The 761st Tank Battalion had been put on alert for deployment to the European Theatre of Operations. They were going to war. The battalion boarded the Esperance Bay in New York City on August 27, 1944. The 10-day voyage across the Atlantic carried them to Avonmouth, United Kingdom, where they drew new equipment. The latest version of the Sherman tank, the M4A3, upgraded with a 76mm cannon. After brief training in England, to familiarize themselves with the new weapons, prepared for the final leg of their journey. On October 10, 1944, the 761st landed in France via Omaha Beach, 4 months after D-Day. The sand was still stained with the blood of thousands who had died there. The Black Panthers walked across that same beach, knowing they carried more than just the weight of their equipment, carried the hopes of millions of Black Americans who needed them to succeed. They carried the expectations of skeptics who expected them to fail, carried the burden of proving something that should have been self-evident, that Black men could fight and die for their country just as bravely as anyone else. Battalion consisted of 6 white officers, 30 black officers, and 676 black enlisted men, organized into companies A, B, C, and D, plus headquarters and service elements. They were assigned to General George S. Patton's Third Army at his request, a fact that surprised many, given Patton's well-documented racial prejudices. On October 28, 1944, just before the battalion entered combat, Patton reviewed the assembled tankers. He stood on the hood of an armored car, wearing his trademark ivory-handled pistols, delivered a speech that would become legendary. "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those crot sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down." It was vintage Patton, profane, dramatic, calculated to inspire. But those who knew the general understood the complexity beneath the words. Patton was a man of contradictions. His grandfather had been a Confederate officer. His writings frequently expressed disdain for black soldiers. After the war, he would insist in his memoir that a colored soldier cannot think fast enough to fight in armor. Yet here he was, welcoming the 761st into his Third Army, most aggressive and successful American force in Europe. Some historians suggest Patton simply needed every tank he could get for his drive across France. Others point to moments in his past when he had stood up for black soldiers, including preventing a lynching when he commanded a fort in El Paso before the war. Perhaps the truth is that Patton was a product of his time, capable of both heroism and bigotry, able to recognize courage when he saw it even while clinging to prejudices that should have been beneath him. For the men of the 761st, Patton's motivations mattered less than his orders had come to fight, and on November 7, 1944, at the small Belgian town of Morville, Les Vic, they would finally get their chance. November 7, 1944, Morville, Les Vic, France. Dawn broke cold and grey across the Lorraine countryside, morning mist rising from fields that had been contested territory since ancient times. The German defensive positions around Morville, Les Vic had been fortified over weeks of preparation, with machine gun nests, anti-tank guns, and minefields protecting approaches to the town. Was textbook defensive warfare. Use the terrain, maximize firepower, make every meter of advance cost the attackers dearly. The 761st Tank Battalion, attached to the 26th Infantry Division's 104th Infantry Regiment, would lead the assault. Captain John Long of B Company took position behind the lead Sherman, commanded by Sergeant Roy King. Long was a no-nonsense officer from Detroit, who had earned his men's respect through competence and courage, not through easy familiarity. Later, he would recall, "I am sure my men thought I was a bastard and hated my guts, but they followed me. They were a well-graced fighting machine." As King's Sherman rumbled forward into Morville, Les Vic, German defenders opened fire with everything they had. The distinctive crack of a Panzerfaust, Germany's shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon, echoed through the narrow streets. King's tank shuddered as the shaped charge warhead struck home. 2 crew members were wounded immediately. The tank ground to a halt, smoke pouring from the impact point. King's surviving crew dragged their wounded comrades to safety behind the immobilized Sherman, even as German small arms fire kicked up dirt around them. Then, rather than taking cover, advanced on foot, hunting down the soldier with the Panzerfaust and killing him in close combat. This was the 761st's introduction to warfare. Brutal, personal, unforgiving. A few streets away, Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers encountered a different problem. German defenders had created a roadblock, using a felled tree and buried mines, blocking the narrow approach road. Infantry pinned down in roadside ditches called for support as German mortar rounds walked closer to their positions. Rivers assessed the situation from his tank commander's position and made a decision that would define his legend. Under heavy enemy fire, he dismounted from his Sherman, exposed to German rifles and machine guns. Moving with deliberate purpose, he attached a cable from his tank to the tree obstacle. Then he remounted and had his driver reverse, its engine roaring as it dragged the massive tree off the road, clearing the path for the column behind him. The advance continued. Morville, Les Vic fell to American and Black Panther forces that evening. Rivers became the first member of the 661st Tank Battalion to receive the Silver Star for gallantry in action, but victory came at a cost. The battalion lost 1 tank destroyed, with several others damaged. Multiple crew members had been wounded, and Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, the commander who had trained them for 2 years and promised to lead them into battle, had been hit by submachine gun fire the night before the attack, while observing German positions. Seriously wounded, he was evacuated to a field hospital. The battalion's executive officer, Major Charles Wingo, assumed command. He lasted less than a day. Wingo had never seen combat before, the reality of warfare. The chaos, the casualties, the constant threat of death broke him. Soldiers watched their new commander shake uncontrollably while observing the battlefield. He was evacuated for combat fatigue and never returned. Lieutenant Colonel Hollis Hunt transferred from another battalion to take command, but the damage to morale was significant. Who had trained together for 2 years were now fighting without the leader who had believed in them from the beginning, led temporarily by an officer who had collapsed under pressure. Now commanded by someone they'd never met yet, they continued to fight. Over the following days, the 761st pushed deeper into German territory. They fought through Moyenvik, Vic-sur Seille, the surrounding countryside. Each engagement taught them lessons about armored warfare that no amount of training could replicate. They learned that the Sherman's armor, while adequate against most German weapons, could be penetrated by the feared 88mm flak guns that Germany used in both anti-aircraft and anti-tank roles. They learned that German Panzerfausts could disable their tanks in close quarters. They learned to coordinate with infantry, to use terrain for cover, to watch for the telltale signs of an ambush. Also learned about death. By the end of November 1944, the 761st Tank Battalion had suffered 156 casualties, 24 men killed in action, 81 wounded, 4 non-battle casualties from accidents, illness, and psychological breakdown. 14 tanks had been evacuated as total losses. Another 20 were damaged in combat, but repairable. These were catastrophic numbers for a unit's first month of combat. Most armored battalions that suffered such losses would be pulled off the line for reconstitution. The 761st received no such reprieve. They were needed. November 10, 1944, brought another moment that would enter the battalion's legend. Sergeant Warren Crecy, a soft-spoken Texan who wore horn-rimmed glasses and seemed almost too gentle for war, was leading his Sherman through the approach to Morville when his tank came under fire from a German anti-tank gun. The shells struck home, destroying the vehicle. Crecy and his crew bailed out into a hail of small arms fire. Rather than seeking cover, Crecy grabbed a .30 caliber machine gun and charged the position that had destroyed his tank. He eliminated the German gun crew, then turned his weapon on 2 forward artillery observers who had been directing fire on American positions. When he commandeered a replacement tank, it immediately became stuck in heavy mud. Under fierce machine gun, anti-tank and artillery fire, Crecy dismounted to free the vehicle. German infantry saw their opportunity and launched an assault. Crecy abandoned his salvage efforts, climbed onto the immobilized tank, and manned its .50 caliber machine gun. What witnesses described next entered the realm of the incomprehensible. Faced sergeant with the gentle demeanor and scholarly glasses became something else entirely. A force of nature, a warrior possessed. He poured sustained fire into the advancing Germans, cutting them down with methodical precision. When his first .50 caliber barrel overheated and warped from sustained firing, he changed barrels and continued. And when that barrel also burned out, he changed it again. The German assault broke. Survivors withdrew, leaving their dead scattered across the approach. Crecy had single-handedly stopped an enemy attack that should have overrun the American position. His fellow tankers had to physically pry the machine gun from his hands, entered a state of combat fury that would earn him the nickname the Baddest Man in the 761st. Crecy was immediately nominated for the Medal of Honor. He would eventually receive the Silver Star instead, a pattern that would repeat throughout the war for black soldiers whose heroism went unrecognized by a military establishment that couldn't quite bring itself to acknowledge that African Americans could be heroes. But it was the events of November 1619 that would produce the 761st's most lasting legend and its most tragic loss. The battalion had been fighting continuously for over a week, pressing eastward through German defensive lines toward the town of Gibbeling. On November 16, Able Company attacked in support of the 26th Infantry Division's advance. Ruben Rivers, now a staff sergeant, commanding his own tank, led the assault. The Germans had learned from previous engagements, had reinforced their defensive positions with additional anti-tank weapons, and littered the approaches with mines. As Rivers, Sherman advanced along a railroad crossing, telltale click boom of a mine detonation echoed across the battlefield. The explosion tore through the tank's belly armor and sent shrapnel slashing upward. Rivers' right leg was laid open to the bone, blood pooling on the tank floor. Must have been excruciating. A compound fracture, combined with the shock of the blast, and the knowledge that his war might be over before it had really begun. David Williams rushed forward when he heard about the injury. He found Rivers conscious but losing blood rapidly. "Ruben, you're going back," Williams ordered. Medical evacuation was the only sensible option. The wound was severe enough to warrant immediate hospitalization. Rivers refused. He declined morphine, knowing it would impair his ability to command. He refused evacuation, insisting his company needed him. Against all medical advice and direct orders from his commanding officer, he took command of another tank and advanced with the company into Gibbeling the next day. For 3 days, while infection spread through his shattered leg, while gangrene blackened the wound, while fever burned through his body, Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers continued to fight. On November 18, Captain Williams found Rivers still in combat, directing his tank's fire at German positions despite the fact that he could barely stand. "Ruben, this is insane," Williams told him. "You're going to lose that leg." My God. Rivers' response has been preserved in military records. "Captain, you know better than that. This is going to be tough. Another 2 days won't make any difference." A medic who examined the wound shouted in alarm, "Listen, he's got gangrene." But before Williams could order an evacuation, German artillery opened fire again, forcing everyone to take cover. It was the last conversation the two men would have. Dawn on November 19 found Company A attempting to push through to Bugoltroff, next objective. But the Germans were waiting with heavy tanks and anti-tank guns. Shermans began taking hits, their thin armor no match for German high-velocity weapons at close range. Captain Williams ordered his tanks to withdraw and take cover. Then came the radio transmission that would seal Rivers' legend. "ICM. We'll fight M." Rivers had spotted the German anti-tank positions. Rather than withdrawing with his company, he and one other tank moved to fire on the enemy positions, providing covering fire for the withdrawal. He was fully exposed, silhouetted against the dawn sky, the perfect target. 2 German shells hit his Sherman in rapid succession. Ruben Rivers was killed instantly. 5 days later, on November 24, Captain Williams recommended Rivers for the Medal of Honor. His citation detailed extraordinary heroism above and beyond the call of duty, refusing medical evacuation despite a severe wound, continuing to lead his men through 3 days of combat while dying from infection, making the ultimate sacrifice to save his company. The recommendation was filed. It disappeared into the bureaucracy of a military that, in 1944, had never awarded the Medal of Honor to a Black American during World War II. Rivers would be posthumously awarded the Purple Heart. His family would receive the standard notification of his death in service to his country, but the Medal of Honor, the recognition of the highest level of valor, would not come. not for 53 years. The 761st continued fighting through November, baptism by fire extending into weeks of sustained combat. They were learning that training, no matter how intensive, could never fully prepare someone for the reality of war. Were learning about fear, not the absence of it, which was impossible, but how to function despite it. They were learning about loss, watching friends die in sudden violence that offered no time for goodbyes or noble last words. And they were learning that they were being watched. Every action was scrutinized. Every mistake was magnified. Every casualty was used as evidence by those who had opposed black combat troops from the beginning. The pressure was immense, unfair, and never ending. Were also proving something that should never have needed proving. The German soldiers facing the 761st didn't care about the color of the skin of the men inside those Shermans, cared about the weight of metal those tanks threw at them, about the competence of the crews, about whether they would break under fire or continue advancing. The Black Panthers kept advancing. As November turned to December, the battalion prepared for the biggest test yet. German forces were massing in the Ardennes forest for a desperate last offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The 761st Tank Battalion, already bloodied but far from broken, was about to face the full fury of Germany's final gamble in the West. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes forest. At precisely 5:30 a.m., an American sentry watching the German line from a forward observation post radioed headquarters with a report that would change the course of the war. Innumerable pinpoints of light, he reported, his voice tense with confusion and growing dread, were flickering all along the enemy positions stretching through the forest. Those pinpoints were muzzle flashes from hundreds of German artillery pieces. Seconds later, roar reached American lines. A thunderstorm of high, explosive shells that turned the frozen Ardennes into hell on earth. Adolf Hitler had committed Germany's last, strategic reserve to one final, desperate offensive. He had assembled 3 armies, over 200,000 men, hundreds of tanks, the elite of what remained of the Wehrmacht and Waffen SS, and aimed them at the weakest point of the Allied line. The objective was audacious, and almost certainly doomed break through to Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace that might spare Germany from total destruction. It was the largest battle the US Army would fight in World War II. It would test every unit thrown into the freezing hell of the Ardennes winter, including the 761st Tank Battalion. Panthers had been fighting for over a month when the German offensive began. They had crossed into Germany itself on December 14, rolling onto German soil with a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. Sergeant Willie McCall climbed out of his Sherman, looked around at the landscape they had fought so hard to reach, spat contemptuously. "So this," he said, "is the home of Superman." 2 days later, when the German offensive erupted, the 761st found themselves rushed northward to help stem the breakthrough, were in no condition for sustained combat. After a month of continuous operations, the battalion was down to a handful of functioning tanks. Personnel casualties had been heavy. Replacement crew members were arriving with inadequate training. Some transferred from other units because they were considered unfit for duty elsewhere. As a result, 761st was not immediately committed to the fighting in the first chaotic days of the German offensive. But at the beginning of January 1945, when American forces transitioned from desperate defense to counterattack, the Black Panthers were thrown back into the battle. Their objective was a town called Tillet, Belgium, sat about 12 miles west of the vital crossroads of Bastogne. where the 101st Airborne Division had been surrounded and besieged since December. Every other American unit assigned to take Tillit had been beaten back. The town was defended by tanks and infantry from the elite FU-Haar Beglet Brigade, Germany's reserve force for protecting Adolf Hitler himself, equipped with the best weapons and most experienced soldiers the Wehrmacht could spare. The fighting for Tillit would prove to be some of the most brutal the 761st experienced. Battalion attacked with just 11 operational tanks, supporting elements of the 87th Infantry Division. The Germans fought with the desperation of men who knew their country was dying. This offensive was likely their last chance to avoid the absolute defeat that was coming. They had fortified every building, positioned anti-tank weapons to cover every approach, and mined every road. For 2 days, the Black Panthers and infantry fought building by building, street by street. Sherman tanks would advance under covering fire, infantry would clear buildings with grenades and close combat, and then the terrible sequence would repeat. German anti-tank guns destroyed 9 of the 11 American tanks. Casualties mounted on both sides, as the winter cold added its own cruelty to the combat. Frostbite, hypothermia, the simple fact that wounded men could freeze to death before medics reached them. But on January 9, 1945, Tillit fell. The victory had strategic implications beyond the immediate tactical success. 761st operations during the Battle of the Bulge had split German lines at 3 critical points. The Hofelies-Bastogne Road, the St. Vith-Bastogne Highway, and the St. Vith-Trier Road. These were the supply arteries keeping German forces around Bastogne alive. By cutting them, the Black Panthers had helped prevent the resupply of German forces and contributed to breaking the siege. When the battle finally ended and the German offensive collapsed, the 761st had been in continuous combat for 65 days. 3 officers and 31 enlisted men had been killed in action. 2 officers and 180 enlisted men had been wounded. The casualty rate approached 50%, losses that would have destroyed most units' ability to function. The 761st continued fighting. Warren Crecy, now commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant for his battlefield heroism, had earned a reputation that preceded him wherever the battalion fought. Germans who survived encounters with his tank reported facing a warrior who seemed immune to fear, who advanced when any sane person would have taken cover, who fought with a fury that bordered on madness. His fellow Black Panthers alternated between awe and concern. They had seen him enter states of combat frenzy, where he had to be physically restrained, where the gentleman they knew disappeared entirely behind the face of war. But they also knew that Crecy's courage gave them courage. When he advanced, they advanced. When he fought, they fought. Leadership in combat isn't about speeches or regulations. It's about one person willing to go first into the fire, showing others that it can be done. By late January 1945, German offensive had been not just stopped but reversed. American forces were pushing eastward again. The 761st found itself assigned to one of the most ambitious operations of the Western Front, breaching the Siegfried Line, or West Wall, as the Germans called it, was the defensive barrier built along Germany's western frontier. It consisted of over 18,000 bunkers, tunnels, anti-tank obstacles stretching for hundreds of miles. These weren't simple fortifications, but engineered defensive positions built into the landscape, with interlocking fields of fire, protected ammunition storage, and positions designed to survive even heavy artillery bombardment. Breaking through required more than firepower. It required coordination between armor, infantry, and air support. It required identifying weak points, concentrating force against them, and exploiting breakthroughs before defenders could seal them. In March 1945, 761st Tank Battalion was assigned as the armored spearhead for Task Force Rhine, attacking the Siegfried Line in conjunction with elements of the 103rd Infantry Division. This wasn't a supporting role or a limited action. This was the primary assault, with black tankers leading the way. From March 20 to March 23, operating far ahead of friendly artillery support and facing fierce German resistance, the 761st attacked and destroyed multiple defensive positions along the Siegfried Line, advanced through interlocking fields of anti-tank fire, through minefields that could destroy a Sherman with a single hidden charge, through machine gun fire that turned roads into kill zones. Corporal Carlton Chapman, a gunner with the battalion, recalled the intensity of those days. Every time we moved forward, it felt like the whole world was trying to kill us. But we couldn't stop. We just couldn't stop. On March 22, the 761st punched through the Siegfried Line's defenses at a critical point, creating a breach that allowed the 4th Armored Division to pour through into Germany proper. It was the kind of breakthrough that armored warfare was designed to achieve. Concentrated force at a weak point, exploitation before the enemy could react, pursuit deep into enemy territory. The success had broader implications. German defensive doctrine assumed that the Siegfried Line would hold long enough for a negotiated peace. Its breach signaled to anyone paying attention that Germany's defeat was now inevitable. The question was no longer if the Allies would win, how long it would take, and how many more would die before the inevitable end. For the Black Panthers, the breach of the Siegfried Line represented vindication. They had been told they couldn't fight. They had been told they lacked the intelligence for complex operations. They had been told that white troops would refuse to serve alongside them. Instead, had been chosen to lead one of the most important operations of the entire campaign. But war offers no time for satisfaction. The 761st continued to advance eastward, fighting through dozens of German towns and cities. As the Third Reich collapsed around them, they encountered pockets of fanatical resistance from SS units who refused to surrender, found German civilians in various states of denial, anger, and despair. They discovered the physical evidence of Germany's crimes: slave labor camps, execution sites, architecture of genocide. In late April 1945, elements of the 761st reached the Gusen concentration camp in Austria, a subcamp of Mauthausen, where tens of thousands of prisoners had been worked to death in underground factories. Panthers weren't among the first American units to liberate a concentration camp. Other forces had already encountered Buchenwald and Dachau earlier in April. But the experience of seeing industrial-scale murder firsthand affected every soldier who witnessed it. Staff Sergeant Floyd Dade, a Texas native who had joined the 761st from civilian life, tried to process what he was seeing. "We were fighting for democracy," he would recall years later. "We didn't even have equal rights ourselves. And here we were, liberating people from the worst evil imaginable." It didn't make sense. But it also made perfect sense. We knew what it was like to be treated as less than human. On April 26, 1945, near the town of Steyr, Austria, 761st Tank Battalion made contact with elements of the Soviet Union's First Ukrainian Front. The meeting of American and Russian forces split the remaining German forces in two and effectively ended organized resistance in the region. When the news came on May 8 that Germany had surrendered unconditionally, the 761st had been in continuous combat for 183 days. Not a single Black Panther had surrendered, deserted. Not one had deserted. Not one had broken under the pressure that had been designed, consciously or unconsciously, to make them fail. Participated in 4 major Allied campaigns across 6 countries. They had inflicted over 130,000 casualties on enemy forces, had captured or liberated 30 towns and cities. They had earned 391 decorations for heroism under fire, including 7 silver stars for valor, 56 bronze stars, nearly 300 Purple Hearts. And they had received exactly 0 recognition from the broader American public. When VE Day came, there were no parades for the Black Panthers, no ticker tape, no national celebration of their contribution. White units returning home were greeted as conquering heroes. 761st Tank Battalion returned to a segregated America where they still couldn't eat at the same lunch counters, drink from the same water fountains, or live in the same neighborhoods as the white soldiers they had fought beside. It would take decades for their story to reach the American public, and it would take over 50 years for the nation to finally acknowledge what had always been true: that the Black Panthers had been among the finest tank battalions in World War II. Their heroism had been systematically ignored because of the color of their skin. June of 1946. Somewhere in Germany, the 761st Tank Battalion officially deactivated on this date the paperwork marking the end of a unit that had earned its place in military history through blood and determination. The tankers who survived returned to the United States in small groups over the following weeks, traveling home to cities and towns across America. They arrived to silence. Were no welcome home parades through city streets. No grateful crowds lining the sidewalks. No bands playing. No politicians giving speeches about their sacrifice and heroism. The white soldiers from other units received these celebrations. Even some all-black units, particularly the famed Tuskegee Airmen, eventually received at least some public recognition. The 761st Tank Battalion came home to a nation that didn't want to acknowledge what they had done, because acknowledging it would require confronting uncomfortable truths about who had been right and who had been wrong in the debates about black soldiers in combat. Staff Sergeant Johnny Stevens, a veteran of the entire campaign, tried to catch a bus home to New Jersey from Fort Benning, Georgia, where he was being processed out of the military. The bus driver took one look at his uniform, saw the color of his skin, and refused to let him board. This was America in 1946. You could fight and bleed for your country. You could prove your courage under fire. You could earn medals for valor. You still couldn't ride in the front of the bus. The experiences of the returning veterans varied by region and circumstance, but a pattern emerged. In the South, Crow laws remained firmly in place. Veterans who had commanded tank companies in Europe found themselves expected to say, "Yes, sir," to white teenagers and step off the sidewalk when white pedestrians approached. Cognitive dissonance was staggering. Men who had defeated Nazi Germany now faced daily humiliation from people who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Floyd Dade, reflecting on the experience years later, captured the contradiction perfectly. We didn't have equal rights. Democracy was against us. But I was fighting for my country. In the North, conditions were marginally better, but still far from equal. Black veterans found themselves excluded from many of the benefits that white veterans received through the GI Bill. In theory, the GI Bill offered education and housing assistance to all veterans. In practice, segregated universities refused to admit black students. Real estate covenants prevented black families from purchasing homes in most desirable neighborhoods. the veterans of the 761st scattered across the country, taking jobs where they could find them, trying to build lives in a nation that couldn't decide whether to honor their service or pretend it never happened. Leonard Smitty Smith, one of the battalion's tankers, eventually found work with the New York City Transit Authority Police, a rare position of responsibility for a black man in that era. His colleague was a man named Alcindor, whose young son Lou, later known as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, would grow up idolizing Uncle Smitty. Without knowing the full story of his heroism in the war, Warren Crecy remained in the army, one of the few black officers retained in the post-war force. He served in Korea, where he was severely wounded in combat for a second time. He retired as a major, both visible and invisible scars from his years of service. His nomination for the Medal of Honor had disappeared into the bureaucratic void, never to resurface during his lifetime. Captain David Williams, the white officer who had commanded Able Company and witnessed Ruben Rivers' heroism firsthand, kept copies of his recommendation for Rivers to receive the Medal of Honor. He knew it had been unjustly denied, understood that racism had prevented proper recognition, but could do nothing about it in an era when such complaints were dismissed out of hand. The Black Panthers who survived the war, the decades that followed, brought a slow, grinding battle for recognition that in some ways proved more difficult than the combat they had survived. At least in combat, the enemy was clearly identified. The enemy was trying to kill you, and you could fight back. But how do you fight against erasure? How do you combat a society that simply pretends your sacrifice never happened? The official military histories, written in the late 1940s and 1950s, barely mentioned the 761st Tank Battalion. When they appeared at all, it was in brief footnotes acknowledging their existence, without detailing their accomplishments. White tank battalions that fought with less distinction received chapters and accolades. The Black Panthers received silence. This wasn't accidental. It was policy, both official and unofficial. A military establishment that had opposed black combat troops from the beginning had no interest in publicizing evidence that undermined their position. A nation still committed to segregation had no desire to elevate black heroes to the same status as white veterans. But the story refused to die. In 1945, while still in Europe, members of the battalion had collaborated with journalist Tresvant Anderson to produce a book titled Come Out Fighting, The Epic Tale of the 761st Tank Battalion, 1942-1945. It was self-published, with limited distribution, but it preserved the battalion's story in their own words. Anderson, who had been embedded with the unit during combat, sent copies to senators and military leaders, advocating for both recognition and integration of the armed forces. His advocacy joined a broader civil rights movement that was slowly building momentum in post-war America. Black veterans who had seen integrated forces in Europe, who had fought alongside white soldiers, who had proven their capabilities under the most extreme conditions imaginable, were no longer willing to accept second-class citizenship at home. The 761st story became part of the arsenal of evidence used by those arguing for military integration. How, they asked, could the United States maintain segregated armed forces when black soldiers had proven themselves equal to any task? How could the nation claim moral authority in the emerging Cold War while denying basic rights to millions of its own citizens? On July 26, 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 981, mandating the integration of the U.S. Armed Forces. The order stated that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. Implementation was slow and uneven. Commanders resisted. Old prejudices died hard. But the principle had been established. The 761st Tank Battalion's service had been part of the evidence that made that principle undeniable. Still, recognition for the battalion itself remained elusive. In 1965, the height of the civil rights movement, renewed efforts began to document the contributions of black military units in World War II. Historians uncovered records that had been filed and forgotten. Veterans began speaking publicly about their experiences. A new generation of Americans, confronting the reality of ongoing racial injustice, wanted to know about the heroes who had been hidden from history. The 761st story slowly emerged. In 1978, 3 years after the end of World War II, President Jimmy Carter finally awarded the 761st Tank Battalion the Presidential Unit Citation. The citation read, 761st Tank Battalion, from 31st October 1944 through 6th of May 1945, participated in action against the enemy in Central Europe. Throughout this period of combat, courageous and professional actions of the members of the Black Panther Battalion, coupled with their indomitable fighting spirit and devotion to duty, reflect great credit on the 761st Tank Battalion, the United States Army, and this nation. It was long overdue. Many veterans who had served with the battalion were dead by then. Whose survived were in their 50s and 60s. Their combat service a fading memory, overshadowed by decades of civilian life and continued discrimination. But the Presidential Unit Citation opened doors that had previously been closed. With official recognition finally granted at the unit level, efforts intensified to ensure that individual heroes received appropriate recognition as well. In 1993, Department of Defense initiated a study to examine whether black soldiers had been systematically denied the Medal of Honor during World War II. Due to racial discrimination, historians at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, were contracted to review records of black soldiers who had received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration, to determine if racial bias had prevented them from receiving the Medal of Honor. The conclusion was unequivocal: yes, black soldiers had been denied the Medal of Honor because of their race. The study identified 10 candidates for reconsideration. 7 were ultimately recommended to receive the Medal of Honor. One of them was Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers. On January 13, 1997, 53 years after his death, President Bill Clinton presented the Medal of Honor posthumously to 7 black World War II veterans in a ceremony at the White House. Vernon Baker, who had served with the 92nd Infantry Division in Italy, was the only recipient still alive to receive his medal in person. The others, including Rivers, had their medals presented to family members. Rivers' sister, Grace Woodfolk, accepted the medal on behalf of her brother and their family. Captain David Williams, now elderly but still alive, attended the ceremony, finally seeing the recognition he had fought for more than 5 decades earlier. President Clinton acknowledged the injustice explicitly. No African American who deserved the Medal of Honor for his service in World War II received it. Today we fill the gap in that picture and give a group of heroes who also love peace but adapted themselves to war the tribute that has always been their due. Now and forever, the truth will be known about these African Americans who gave so much that the rest of us might be free. The ceremony represented more than medals. To stageries, it was an acknowledgement that the nation had been wrong, that racism had denied heroes their due recognition, that the debt could never be fully repaid, but at least could be acknowledged. Warren Crecy, who had been nominated for the Medal of Honor multiple times during the war, did not receive it even in this belated recognition. He had died in 2009, having retired as a major after serving in World War II and Korea. His Silver Star and Battlefield Commission stood as testament to his valor. The highest recognition remained elusive, a reminder that even in correction, injustice sometimes persists. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, 761st Tank Battalion's story had entered broader public consciousness. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who had grown up knowing Smitty without understanding his history, authored a book titled Brothers in Arms, the epic story of the 761st Tank Battalion, W's Forgotten Heroes. The book brought renewed attention to the unit and introduced their story to a new generation. Documentaries were produced. Morgan Freeman, himself a military veteran, became involved in projects highlighting the battalion's contributions. Educational programs were developed. Memorials were erected at Fort Hood, where the battalion had trained, other locations significant to their story. In 2005, a monument dedicated to the 761st Tank Battalion was unveiled at Fort Hood during a ceremony attended by surviving veterans. Aging tankers, now in their 80s, stood at attention one final time as their service was honored publicly. The recognition came too late for most of the 712 officers and men who fought with the 761st during World War II. Fewer than 100 were still alive by 2005. Many had died without ever receiving proper recognition for their service, had lived their entire adult lives knowing that their nation had asked everything of them, and then tried to pretend they had never answered that call. Also lived long enough to see their story finally told. They lived to see segregation formally abolished in the military, and, gradually, in civilian life, lived to see black officers reach the highest ranks of military command. Lived to see a nation that had once questioned whether they could fight begin to understand that the question should never have been asked. The last living member of the 761st Tank Battalion passed away in the 2010s. With his death, the direct connection to those 183 days of combat was severed. But the legacy remained. The 761st story is taught in schools now. Their service is studied in military academies. Their contribution is acknowledged in the official histories that once ignored them. Young officers learning about armored warfare study the battalion's tactics. Students learning about civil rights examine their fight on two fronts. Black Panthers proved something that should never have needed proving. That courage has no color. That heroism transcends race. The content of character is measured under fire regardless of the shade of skin. They paid a terrible price for that proof. 50% casualties. 71 tanks lost. 180. 3 days in combat without respite. Men like Ruben Rivers giving their lives for a country that refused to treat them as equals. Warriors like Warren Crecy fighting with a fury born from years of injustice. Veterans like Johnny Stevens coming home to find they still couldn't ride in the front of the bus, also achieved something that transcended their own experiences. They helped make possible the military integration that followed, contributed to the civil rights movement by providing undeniable evidence of black capability. They inspired future generations to demand the equality that should have been their birthright. In 2020, during nationwide protests against racial injustice and police violence, the name Black Panthers took on renewed significance. A new generation discovered the original Black Panthers, not the political organization of the 1960s, but the tankers of World War II, who had first carried that name and motto into battle. Parallel seemed appropriate. Both groups fought against systems designed to diminish and destroy them. Both refused to accept second-class status. Both understood that demanding equality sometimes requires confrontation with power that would prefer silence and submission. The tankers of the 761st would have understood the protests of 2020, would have recognized the continuation of a fight they had begun. They had stood up in 1942 by insisting they be allowed to fight for their country, had stood up in 1944 by proving they could fight as well as anyone. They had stood up after 1945 by refusing to let their story be erased, and in doing so, had opened a path for everyone who came after them. The morning sun breaks over Fort Hood, Texas. The monument stands silent, bronze figures frozen in a moment of eternal vigilance. Plaques detail the story, the training, the combat, the sacrifice, the too long delayed recognition. Visitors pause to read, to photograph, to honor. Most never knew this story. Most don't understand what these men fought for and against. But they learn. The monument teaches. The story spreads. This is how memory works. This is how the dead speak to the living. 761st Tank Battalion fought 2 wars simultaneously. The first war was against Nazi Germany, a totalitarian regime that had murdered millions in pursuit of a twisted ideology of racial supremacy. War was won decisively on the battlefields of Europe, though the cost in lives and suffering was almost incomprehensible. The second war was against the racial prejudice of their own nation, a fight that began long before 1942 and continues, in different forms, to this day. That war has no final victory, only progress measured in generations, in changed laws, in shifting attitudes, in opportunities that were once unthinkable becoming merely difficult. Black Panthers contributed to both wars in ways that echo across decades. Their military contribution is now documented and studied. Military historians analyzing the European campaign acknowledge that the 761st was among the most effective tank battalions in the entire US Army. Their extended training, which had resulted from prejudice and indecision about how to use black troops, paradoxically made them better prepared for combat than many white units that were rushed to the front with minimal preparation. Their tactical innovations influenced armored warfare doctrine, the way they coordinated with infantry, their adaptation to challenging terrain, their willingness to press attacks, even under heavy casualties. All became case studies for future officers. These lessons were learned from a segregated black unit, was often omitted from official instruction, but the tactics themselves entered the Army's institutional knowledge, role in major operations. The Battle of the Bulge, the breaching of the Siegfried Line, the final advance into Germany, put them at critical moments in the war's conclusion. While no single unit was indispensable, the 761st's absence would have been felt. Battles would have been harder. More soldiers would have died. The timeline might have shifted. Broader cultural and social impact exceeded even their military contribution. The 761st proved that the rationale for segregation in the military had been based on prejudice rather than fact. Every argument against black combat troops, that they lacked intelligence, courage, discipline, leadership potential, was systematically demolished by their service. This proof couldn't be dismissed as anecdotal or exceptional. An entire battalion, fighting for over 6 months, couldn't be explained away as outliers. Evidence the 761st provided became ammunition in the fight for military integration. When President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, Black Panther service was among the justifications cited. When the Army resisted integration, advocates pointed to units like the 761st as proof that integration would strengthen rather than weaken military effectiveness. the pattern repeated in civilian life. Arguments for school integration, for housing equality, for workplace integration, all deployed the same logic that had been proven on the battlefields of Europe. If black soldiers could be trusted with America's most sophisticated weapons, could fight alongside white troops, could demonstrate courage under the most extreme conditions, the rationale for segregation in civilian life became even harder to defend. Jackie Robinson's breaking of baseball's color barrier in 1947 connected directly to his service with the 761st. His military experience, including his court-martial for refusing to move to the back of a bus, prepared him for the hostility he would face as the first black Major League Baseball player. The discipline he learned, the ability to maintain composure under pressure, the understanding that he was representing something larger than himself, all were lessons from his time with the Black Panthers. Robinson explicitly credited his fellow tankers with teaching him that excellence could overcome prejudice. When he faced racial slurs from opposing players, when fans screamed abuse, when teammates initially refused to accept him, Robinson drew on the example of men like Ruben Rivers and Warren Crecy, who had faced death and discrimination with equal courage. Ripple effects extended further. Black veterans of World War II, having seen what integrated forces could accomplish in Europe, returned home less willing to accept second-class status. They became leaders in local civil rights movements, using organizational skills learned in the military and drawing on the moral authority of their service. When confronted with racist opposition, they could ask a question that was difficult to answer. I was good enough to fight and die for this country. Why am I not good enough to vote in it? The 761st story also influenced how the military thought about integration more broadly. The success of black tank battalions demonstrated that complex technical skills could be mastered regardless of race. This opened possibilities beyond combat roles. If black soldiers could operate and maintain tanks, they could certainly work with radar systems, communications equipment, aircraft maintenance, every other technical specialty the military required. The modern US military, the most integrated institution in American society, traces part of its culture to units like the 761st. The principle that competence matters more than color, that diversity strengthens, rather than weakens effectiveness. Teams work best when they're based on merit rather than prejudice. These ideas seem obvious now, but were revolutionary in 1942. Battalion's motto, "Come out fighting," took on layers of meaning beyond its original combat context. It became a call to action for anyone facing discrimination. Accept injustice quietly. Don't wait for others to grant you equality. Fight for it. Prove your worth. Demand recognition. Philosophy influenced the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. understood that change required confrontation. Progress came through sustained pressure, rather than patient waiting. Panthers of World War II had demonstrated that refusal to accept imposed limitations could lead to victories that had seemed impossible. In military circles, 761st remains a touchstone for discussions about leadership under pressure. The battalion's ability to maintain effectiveness, despite losing half its strength in combat, despite being led temporarily by officers who broke under stress, despite facing discrimination from their own command structure, all speak to resilience that transcends normal expectations. Officer candidates study how commanders like Captain David Williams led effectively in impossible circumstances. How do you maintain morale when your soldiers are dying for a country that treats them as inferior? How do you convince men to advance into fire when they've already given more than should ever have been asked? The answers found in the 700 and 661st history provide lessons that remain relevant. Battalion's story also serves as a reminder of costs that can never be fully calculated. Every black soldier who died in World War II died for a country that denied him equal rights. Every veteran who came home to discrimination carried a wound that no medal could heal. 64 question is not whether their sacrifice was worthwhile. They had no choice in that. But whether the nation they defended learned the lessons their service should have taught. Progress has been made. The military is integrated. Legal segregation has been abolished. Opportunities that were once closed to black Americans are now, at least theoretically, available. Systemic racism persists in different forms, and the fight the Black Panthers began remains unfinished. This perhaps the most important part of their legacy. The understanding that achieving equality requires constant effort, that each generation must continue the fight. Victories won must be defended and built upon. The Black Panthers, who survived long enough to see real progress in civil rights, often expressed mixed feelings. Pride in what they had accomplished. Satisfaction that younger generations faced fewer barriers, but also sadness that recognition had come so late. That so many comrades had died without acknowledgement. The nation had been so slow to honor what should have been honored immediately. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, writing about the tankers he came to know through Uncle Smitty, captured this complexity. These men were heroes twice over. First in combat against Nazi Germany. Second in maintaining their dignity and continuing to contribute to a society that treated them so poorly. Could have become bitter and withdrawn. Instead, they built families, built careers, built communities. Might be the most remarkable part of their story. The educational legacy of the 761st continues to expand. Schools use their story to teach not just military history, but also civil rights history, social studies, and ethics. How do we respond when treated unjustly? What does true heroism look like? How can we recognize when societal structures are built on prejudice rather than merit? These aren't just historical questions. Students today see parallel situations in their own world and can draw lessons from how the Black Panthers navigated theirs. The specifics change. Technology evolves. Society progresses. New forms of discrimination emerge. But the fundamental principles remain constant. Courage means acting despite fear. Excellence means refusing to accept imposed limitations. Leadership means advancing when others retreat. Sacrifice means giving for something larger than yourself. These were the lessons the 761st lived. They remain as relevant today as they were in 1944. The physical monuments to the battalion. At Fort Hood, at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Various locations where they fought serve as gathering points for remembrance. Veterans' families visit to see where their fathers or grandfathers trained and fought. Students on field trips learn about a chapter of history that their textbooks may have overlooked. Tourists stumble across the story and leave with new understanding. But the true monument is the one built in memory and action. Every time someone stands up against discrimination, they honor the Black Panthers. Every time a leader refuses to accept lower expectations based on race, they continue the fight the 761st began. Every time a soldier of any background is judged by competence rather than color, battalion sacrifice achieves its purpose. The last living member of the 761st is gone now. No more first-hand accounts. No more direct testimony. The voices we have are recorded interviews, written memoirs, official reports, and the second-hand stories passed down through families. But those voices still speak, tell us that the arc of history is long but bends toward justice. But only when people fight to bend it. They tell us that excellence can overcome prejudice. The price is often unfairly high. They tell us that courage is not the absence of fear, but action despite fear. Most powerfully, tell us that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when given the chance, when judged fairly, when recognized for who they are rather than dismissed for what others assume they must be. 761st Tank Battalion earned their place in history through blood and fire. They proved their worth 100 times over. They sacrificed in ways that should never have been necessary. They waited decades for the recognition they deserved. Their patience should shame us. Their persistence should inspire us. Their story should remind us that the fight for equality is never truly finished, that each generation inherits both the progress made and the work remaining. Come out fighting. The motto wasn't just about combat. It was about life, about refusing to accept injustice, about demanding the respect and opportunity that should be every person's birthright, about proving through action what words alone could never establish. The Black Panthers came out fighting on the battlefields of Europe. They came out fighting in the decades after, battling for recognition and equality. And their story continues to call others to fight. Not with tanks and guns now, but with persistence and principle, with education and action, determination to build a society that finally lives up to the ideals that men like Ruben Rivers died defending. That is the legacy of the 761st Tank Battalion. Not just what they did, what they made possible for everyone who came after. If this story moved you, if it made you remember the names time tried to erase, illuminated a chapter of history that had been hidden in shadow, if it revealed heroes who deserved to stand alongside the most celebrated figures of World War II, then share it. Tell others. Keep their memory alive. Because the greatest injustice would be for their story to remain forgotten. The second greatest would be for us to remember their sacrifice, but ignore the lessons it teaches. The Black Panthers earned their place in history. Now it's our responsibility to ensure they keep it. Come out fighting.